Welcome everybody to the DeepMed seminar. It's a history forum for ocean science, strategy and environment. Today I have the pleasure to introduce José Carlos Cañizares, who's going to talk about systems thinking in the Mediterranean, science and politics in a sea under siege. José Carlos has degrees in telecommunications and philosophy, telecommunications engineering and philosophy, and a master's in STS and philosophy of science and technology. In 2023, he obtained his PhD from Delft University of Technology with an interdisciplinary thesis on resilience. It's an influential approach, as probably some of you know, for assessing and managing risk in complex systems, from ecosystems to cities exposed to climate risk, socio-technical system, and earth systems. His thesis in particular focused on epistemological aspects of resilience-based approaches and on ethical and political questions that resilience-based management raises. Since, I think, last spring, so a little less than a year, he works with us in the project HAPEARTH, which is a sister project to DeepMed, and it's on history and philosophy of the earth and environmental sciences. And as part of that, we've done a collaborative project, which is basically what he's going to be presenting here today. So thank you, everybody, and we'll have, as usual, about 45 minutes of presentations and then Q&A. Please, José Carlos, when you are ready.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Lina, for the presentation, for inviting me here also, although I'm a sort of member of the house also, but nonetheless. Well, this article, System Thinking in the Mediterranean, is of course not intended as a complete history of systems thinking in the Mediterranean. It's a collaborative effort, as Lino said, between Pablo Lima, PhD candidate, Lino, and myself. And I would rather define it as a critical history article with a philosophical spin to it that analyzes key episodes and trends in that history of systems thinking in the Mediterranean and engages critically and uses that analysis to engage critically with other histories of the environment and of the earth and environmental sciences. On the one hand, we engage with some recent histories, global histories of the earth and environmental sciences that insist much on the integrative aspect of these sciences. This integration theme has ontological, epistemological, and institutional ramifications that are perhaps most visible in the earth system sciences. Founded by NASA in the 1980s, earth system science views nature explicitly as an interconnected system whose understanding requires bringing together manifold disciplines, data sources, models concerned with biological, atmospheric, oceanographic, whatever processes, and also developing infrastructures capable of producing and managing that disparate data consistently. And it is also described as being strongly solutions-oriented, which means that it increasingly attends to socio-economic aspects, management and governance issues even, leading or creating organisms devoted essentially to policymaking or advice to policymakers. Examples are the IPCC, the Stockholm Resilience Center, so forth. The article also engages with two regional histories, two analyses of the role of the earth and environmental sciences in regional integration, both scientific and political. First, Diana Davis' work on Mediterranean plant ecology, which describes how French botanists engaged in colonial expeditions drew from early ecological ideas about a balanced nature to portray Maghrebi landscapes as potential forests that had desertified only through local mismanagement. As she shows, this discourse of a degraded Eden directed, oriented ecosystem management practices that shaped and reproduced colonial relations in the region for decades and still do now, she argues, And we also discussed Peter Haas Saving the Mediterranean, a classical monograph on the creation of the United Nations Environment Programme Mediterranean Action Plan, which was a pioneer effort in regional environmental governance starting in the 70s. Haas' argument was that the integrative mindset or ideology, he says also, of UNEP scientists led them or was key in helping to integrate regional research efforts, interdisciplinary regional research efforts, and also in advancing ambitious governance measures that cemented the success of the UNEP map. As I said before, our article examines key episodes and trends in the history of the earth and environmental sciences in the Mediterranean, while critically using those episodes to critically revisit these global and regional histories. But our argument is going to be that systems thinking coming from the earth and environmental sciences, although they have indeed favored regional integration processes, rather than these integration processes being a straight trajectory towards a self-evident unity, what we find is multiple integration efforts and often conflicting. The plan of the talk is going to reproduce more or less the structure of our article. So if we have recirculated it among you, you will be familiar with it. First, I will offer some, next page. It doesn't go to the next page. First, I will offer some basic background on early scientific research and political moves towards scientific and political integration in the Mediterranean, also sketching the Cold War landscape of scientific efforts in the region. Then I will critically revisit Haas' account of the UNEP map, the Mediterranean Action Plan. After that, I will outline how traditional pictures of the Mediterranean changed since the mid-80s, until the 90s. And after this, I will explore how this change of picture bears or has had an impact or is related to more recent moves towards regional integration of regional science and governance. I conclude by briefly returning to the narratives examined just before. So let's go to the first section. The paper is dense, and I'm going to try to be slow about it so that we can put everything together, because it really was an effort at integration from our part also. And the result, if it has any problem, I think it's density. Well, the Mediterranean as a scientific and techno-political concept since the 19th century. We'll start by examining very briefly how scientific conceptions of the Mediterranean as a unit had a major role in the expansionary efforts of European colonial powers in the 19th century. France and other continental powers focusing more on the Mediterranean as a biogeographical region whose common climate and species could perhaps explain anthropological features of its inhabitants and help or offer guidance in governing the region, in the colonies. This contrasting a bit with the British Empire orientation in the region, which treated the sea or focused on the sea more as a hydrological unit and tried to characterize the distinctiveness of Mediterranean waters vis-a-vis the Atlantic waters, right? In the 19th century too, besides these scientific efforts, you have major technopolitical efforts integrating the region, such as the layout of telegraph cables. But perhaps the most important among these was the Suez Canal, which turned the Mediterranean into a shipping lane for the British Empire. The first important efforts, I would say, in international and interdisciplinary research take place, though, in the early 20th century, especially around the nexus between oceanography and fisheries policy, with oceanographic research becoming important in leading or as an input in fisheries policy negotiations between France, Italy, and Spain, and also the creation of the Mediterranean Science Commission, the CSM, in these years, 1910, 1920s. But I'll go straight to outlining certain aspects of the landscape of research activities in the early Cold War that I think are particularly interesting indeed, at least for the argument of the article, focusing especially on these bridges between oceanography and fisheries science. In oceanography, there were two basic research streams in the Mediterranean in these years: fine-scale studies driven by anti-submarine warfare, and broad-scale studies animated by the aim of understanding the role of the Mediterranean in the global ocean circulation. The latter thing, called budget studies, dominated regional oceanography for decades, to the detriment of the other. These studies approached the Mediterranean much like the first British expeditions, as a hydrological unit, or rather a coupled atmosphere-ocean system, the Atlantic-Mediterranean system, which was considered as a system with large-scale constraints, and the purpose was to understand the characteristic physico-chemical properties that delimited the one from the other, the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Interestingly, budget models frame the Atlantic-Mediterranean system as a hydraulic system based on hydraulic control theory, dominating those days, where the system was fueled by an Atlantic inflow of water, an Atlantic water inflow. The Mediterranean was an engine of deep water production, and the system was regulated through the Gibraltar valve, where exchanges of water, salt, and heat took place. In essence, then, these models treated the Mediterranean as more or less as a black box. What they were after was understanding the basic water types, the inflows and outflows of the system, but they tended to neglect the journeys of the water masses within the basin. Crucially, the system was also supposed to reach thermohaline equilibrium by exchanging matter energy with the atmosphere, with land, and with the Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar. The picture shows a more advanced budget model that already considers 20 boxes, and thus exchanges within the basin between the different boxes, but the boxes illustrate the approach, right? What you are interested in is the exchanges between the boxes, not what's inside the box. There are interesting relationships between this research stream and fisheries science. In these years, food scarcity was a key security issue, prompting ecological work in marine research and also a strong boost to fisheries science and management. Concerns with food security were especially pressing in the Mediterranean as a resource-poor and heavily exploited, also geopolitically sensitive area. And this led to the creation of the General Fisheries Council of the Mediterranean by the FAO, United Nations FAO, whose purpose was to control and, if possible, increase the yields of Mediterranean fisheries. Fisheries managers, here's one point in common with budget studies, used the common assumptions of systems ecology and resource management of the time. The idea was that they assumed an optimal level of exploitation of stocks, the maximum sustainable yield, and that was thought, if you kept exploitation up until that level, recovery of the stocks was thought to be guaranteed. This assumption of a balanced system that tends to stay or return to equilibrium was thus a point in common between oceanographic budget models and fishery science. But there was another point in common that we already saw before, which was collaboration. Budget models were sometimes useful for fisheries managers, especially when direct evaluations of stocks, such as provided, for example, by the GFCM, the General Fisheries Commission, when these were not available or were insufficient, fisheries managers needed estimates for their population dynamics models, and they would turn to budget models of oceanographers that would give them at least some productivity estimates that were not always useful, but were at least something to feed the models with. In short, systems thinking in these years fostered the integration processes in the Mediterranean since the 19th century, but in the 20th century, especially on the oceanography and fisheries nexus, with Cold War priorities further channeling these integration trends in at least two ways. On the one hand, marine biology languished beyond the narrow domain of fisheries. I haven't explained this broader broader issues of marine biology, you need to follow me here. In the article, I give a bit more detail about that. We give. And on the other hand, questions about the internal dynamics of the Mediterranean Sea were somewhat sidelined in favor of a large-scale picture of the sea that represented the Mediterranean as a static whole in balance with its surroundings. Okay. We now turn to the 70s. 60s, there start to be concerns about pollution, large-scale human activities, mainly pollution, but other activities also disturbing this natural balance of the Mediterranean. Pollution had become, of course, a public concern elsewhere, especially in industrial and wealthy areas, directing major international agreements. For example, 1972 UNCHE conference, United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. Enclosed seas had become particularly interesting for ecologists since they were mid-scale systems which were suitable for modeling, for whole system experiments, and also as places where management conflicts were more common and serious, and so potential testbeds for management approaches. In this context, the notoriety of concerns about the pollution in the Mediterranean emerged as a timely target for made the Mediterranean appear as a timely target for ecological research on ecological systems, human-induced stresses on systems, and so forth. In the 70s, then, the Mediterranean hosted important international interdisciplinary modeling efforts, also raising heated debates about what kind of system the Mediterranean is, and relatedly, how should we protect it or manage it. The picture is a model of the Eastern Basin that was made in one of those meetings by UNESCO and IBP, using the ecology zones energy circuit language and illustrating this kind of work. You can see interesting things in this picture, such as the focus on land runoffs, pollution, migration, species migration. That is, it's an attempt at integrating social and ecological aspects, and of course, lots of physical chemical processes. There are more detailed models also produced in those meetings, but this is interesting as a model of the entire Eastern Basin. These concerns with pollution ultimately prompted the Barcelona Convention in 1972, where the UNEP map was signed, led by the United Nations Environment Programme. This was the first big initiative in regional environmental governance of the seas, the first of many. Peter has said in the Mediterranean is the classic account of these processes, of the events preceding, surrounding, and right after the creation of the UNEP map. Has explains us how the inherently interdisciplinary and politically ambitious role of the UNEP epistemic communities, or EPICOMs, as he calls them, has become established in the literature, was key in coordinating countries and balancing the interests of countries and organizations towards producing ambitious interdisciplinary studies and political agreements, which cemented the success of the map, as we said before. And he also explains how the map was subsequently upscaled and used as a model for further initiatives. Nonetheless, in our article, we argue that Haas's success story needs nuancing in various regards, some of them recognized by Haas himself. For example, he told us that many countries wanted to exclude USSR presence from the UNEP map, and that this led them to leave the Black Sea out of the program. But also, with the Black Sea, many other non-littoral riparian states, such as Sudan and Portugal, in practice, thus preventing adequate research and management of key sources of pollution, such as the Sea of Marmara. And Haas also acknowledged that many UNEP map delegates did not really share the integrative spirit or ideology of the UNEP. For example, the French Plan Bleu, an ambitious effort at integrating the socioeconomic causes of pollution in ecological modeling and policy, was rejected by most countries, especially North African countries, who viewed it as a European intrusion on their development aims. Thus, it lacked support and it was subsequently sidestepped or deleted from other programs similar to the UNEP map. But besides those things that Haas himself recognized, Haas could not know this, but right after the book was published, the UNEP map entered into a long decline period with financial hardships, and also the growing dominance of the region, shifting priorities of the developed countries in the north away from the UNEP map. And crucially too, you could argue that in this year's science and policy were dominated by the idea of an essentially stable and manageable Mediterranean, and a conception that would be challenged by subsequent research and interpretation of that research. You could see that, especially in quotes such as the first that you have there, the Mediterranean as used by man is a collection of small systems. So the lesson for management is let's ignore everything but the coast and focus on targeted pragmatic measures in coastal areas regarding pollution, and that will be it. But even the ambitious Plan Bleu published a scenario analysis, a very comprehensive scenario analysis in 1988, where still the human factors were considered variant, demographic, technological, economic, but instead the natural factors were considered invariant with respect to the scale of human activities. So the implication was that the Mediterranean is relatively stable and easy to manage. We just need to remove or reduce the disturbances to which it is submitted, and the system will restore its equilibrium naturally. This picture of the Mediterranean changed, however, in the 90s, starting to change in the 80s, but most clearly toward the end of the 90s, its acceptance is widespread. There's change of picture among scientists. As a result, I would say, of emerging scientific ideas, not just regionally, but globally, well, non-equilibrium systems, ecology, but also due to a new generation of scientific projects in the region, as well as to, importantly, changes in the state of the sea itself. I will focus on the regional projects and won't say much of it either because this is a summary. Where in the 80s and 90s, the Mediterranean hosts major projects concerned specifically with mesoscale processes such as eddies. Eddies are transient and often small turbulences that can last weeks, days, also years. They can be 100 kilometers wide, but also some dozens of meters. But they can have important effects at several scales. Scientists found that the eddy field in the Eastern Basin, there were many eddies, eddy field in the Eastern Basin, and that it dominated features of large-scale circulation. So this raised interesting questions because the behavior and biogeochemical and ecological consequences of eddies were not well understood, which prompted scientists to start major interdisciplinary efforts such as MTP project, whose organization you see there, and Matter, that was the offspring of MTP and the one more famous for its achievements. MTP and Matter, well, MTP was not a NEO project, Matter was, but MTP came also from the Council of European Communities, the antecedent of the European Union, included groups of physical oceanographers, marine ecologists, marine biologists, chemists, all gathered around explicitly interdisciplinary questions, pretty much in the spirit of Earth system science by the 1986 with the International Geosphere and Biosphere Program. You can see that in the organization featuring many projects, so in the organization chart, featuring many projects, all concerned with the interactions between those three kinds of questions. And Matter yielded surprising discoveries about many sources of variability, different scales, also MTP, but Matter For example, matter produced the first evidence, worldwide evidence for anthropogenic climate change in the Mediterranean. And this project and others also motivated a wave of biological surveys whose findings challenge traditional ideas of the Mediterranean as being, especially the Eastern Basin, as being more or less a desert. We engage with that issue in the part on Cold War science and 19th century science, but that was a traditional conception, the Mediterranean being lifeless, especially in depth. And this starts to be challenged in these days, where the biological surveys prompted by the biogeochemical projects such as Matter and conducted since the late 80s lead biologists to realize that more than a desert, the Eastern Basin was a stable system oscillating periodically or directed by pulse events between a desert-like and an oasis-like state. And importantly, they also realized that much of life in the Mediterranean was endemic and rare, wasn't found anywhere else. And this led the senior advisor of the World Wide Fund to characterize or classify the Mediterranean as a biodiversity hotspot. Actually, he mentioned a generalized macro biodiversity hotspot, and that is interesting because normally biodiversity hotspot, you need to be a spot with an unusual amount of rare and endemic species. Okay, the Mediterranean has that, but also there's a pragmatic consideration to being classified as a biodiversity hotspot, which is being the focus meriting localized conservation efforts as a region. Of course, the Mediterranean is too large for being that, but nonetheless, that's why they classified it as macro generalized biodiversity hotspot, an odd category that I haven't ever seen with any other region. Well, the surprising discoveries related to oceanography and to life in the Mediterranean emerging from these projects were, in some, quickly read by scientists into the logic of non-equilibrium systems thinking that had appeared or was starting to become dominant in these years in ecology and also in physics. Scientists often mention an episode called the Eastern Mediterranean Transit, whose representation you can see there as illustrative of this change of picture. This event, which spanned much of the 1990s, starting in the 88, I think, until the 87, 99, it had never been observed before, had never been predicted, and was totally new. It consisted in a shift in the source of deep water production in the Eastern Basin from the southern Adriatic to the southern Aegean. Its causes are still unknown, they are much debated, but its consequences were manifold, such as, for example, in changing the areas where convection occurs, also the areas of nutrient upwelling change. So you have changes in productivity depending on area. Some fisheries appear, others disappear. You have shifts in deep sea community structures and so forth. Together with other discoveries about the Mediterranean past, Salinian Mesolithic crisis and others, this Eastern Mediterranean transient promoted a novel picture of the Mediterranean as a highly variable and interconnected whole that could abruptly change from one state to another, and this potentially happening at many scales up to the basin scale. Perhaps human impacts, such as climate warming that had been detected in Matter, could precipitate such changes. So various scientists involved in Matter quickly draw conclusions for management and governance. Among these, we find these two quotes that I think quite revealing. The need to adopt the concept of resilient nature applied to policy, recognizing that variability is a fundamental and important ecosystem characteristic to protect, also the need for adaptive management, and the need to spatially integrate all the research and management across the entire complete spectrum of scales, and also temporal integration of scales in economic analysis as well. Well, I will stop a second. Are you following me? Oh,
yeah.
You're still here? Next page. So these demands, oh no, okay. So these demands coming from matter scientists express decisive changes in regional environmental governance since the 1990s. However, contrary to what the claims suggest, the relevant changes did not result from a change on the scientific representations of the Mediterranean that these scientists found in matter projects and so forth. Rather, they echo ideas and directions that have become globally hegemonic in this decade and that were informing and have been since informing governance efforts in many places. Perhaps a good starting point for describing the noted changes is the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, where the Sustainable Development Agenda becomes globally hegemonic, but also the first convention on biological diversity is celebrated. And this convention advances a broad conception of biodiversity as encompassing genetics diversity, species diversity, and ecosystems diversity, which manages to turn biodiversity into a broad umbrella issue able to capture various environmental concerns at the same time, and thus becoming, suitable environmental pillar of sustainable development. The move also promotes a shift away from traditional conservation that was traditionally focused on iconic or charismatic species and landscapes or economically valuable ones, to a conception more based directly on ecological science. And there's another important turning point. Well, there are many possibly, but I will focus on the 2008 Convention on Biological Biodiversity. I think it's the fourth every 2 years, where the 12 Malawi principles are adopting, and with them, ecosystem-based management is enshrined as the regional and as the approach, the reference framework for environmental governance. Ecosystem-based management is based on resilience and adaptive management, and it constitutes a shift away from species toward a systems approach to environmental governance, social environmental governance, social environmental technical economic governance, familiar governance. Who knows? At least in light of frameworks such as you can see in the picture, inspired by the European Union Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which endorsed and used since 2008 the ecosystem-based management as the cornerstone of its policies, and as a common language for kind of coordinating the work of many actors in the region and promoting some sort of common ground. The Marine Strategy Framework Directive itself being part of the EU's broader strategy of blue growth, stated in its integrated marine policy. This picture, you can see many interesting things. It tries to kind of use all the labels and organize them in a coherent way. It's a bit, I see it's a bit scary, but you can see here the reference to adaptive management. Vision, it says GNs, that's an acronym for goals of good environmental status, which are the basis of the MSPD, European Marine Strategy, so on. Also, there's a management pillar, which is the big triangle, and two smaller triangles, which are social pillar, ecological pillar, the ecological pillar demanding indicators and databases and so forth, special data infrastructure, the other asking for participation. And then the focus on risk, on would say resilience, but the focus on risk management, that's very common. And the intention to be explicitly scalable, as you can see in the three triangles at the top. That is of being able to address, for example, beach and coastal management. This framework is borrowed from beach management, but it's explicitly framed as scalable, potentially covering the entire basin. well, I haven't said nothing about Monachus monachus, the monk seal, but it's one of it represents kind of the focus of traditional ecology on emblematic species. In the end, it should be encompassed by the approach where, with the indicators and databases allowing you to monitor the status of the habitats of the monk seal, whatever, but it of course disappears into kind of the system of system that becomes the new orientation. Well, the EBM, due to its focus on connectivity, on the not just ecosystems rather than species, but also the connections between ecosystems and how that is important for the resilience, has favored another shift from standalone marine protected areas to a more network conception of marine protected areas as a special tool for kind of implementing the ecosystem-based management. And the picture shows the most important networks of marine protected areas that were operating, not currently, I don't know currently, but in 2017, we need to update the picture in publication. If we finally, in 2017, the most important one were the Natural 2000 sites, but there were a few others. These networks have been kept on and expanding, especially Natura 2000 network, to stay in line with rising conservation demands coming from further conventions on biological diversity. For example, in 2008, it was advanced the famous IG Target 11, stating the need to protect 10% of the seas, but this target has been reviewed upward several times. I think now we are around 30%, that's the proposal. The science and management of MPA networks has also become a complex affair involving tasks and decisions, such as which protection sites, choosing protection sites, determining their ideal size and shape, evaluating connectivity between sites, deciding management actions and timeframes, and so forth, which has in turn motivated a growing role for integrated planning approaches such as systematic conservation planning, usually computer-aided, also in the Mediterranean. I will not enter into details about that. But these initiatives are integrating conservation and environmental protection efforts face important challenges. To start with, well, one thing that you can see in the pictures, anybody has an idea coming to mind about this picture, marine protected areas that you can see there? Any peculiarity? They're all in the north. They're all in the north, and they're all in the coast. So there have been complaints about the ecological representativeness of the marine protected areas, because they represent rather political, economic interests, ability to protect, rather than ecological need for protection of their ecological representativeness, which is the concept ecologists use. And also the fact that there are no remoted from the coast, no areas remoted from the coast is significant for the same reason. Marine protected areas are criticized for their ecological representativeness, but also for their poor management many times, especially by organizations such as World Wide Fund and International Union Conservation of Nature, which is very important in the history of marine protected areas, marine reserves, and so forth. In addition to that, things are probably going to get worse in the next decades, with scientists alerting of many risks in the region, more or less connected to warming. Since the 1970s, and increasingly in the last decades, for example, invasion by tropical species through Suez have accelerated. And as the figure shows, the trajectory of populations is often towards northwest, which is where cooler pockets of the Mediterranean are. Populations are expanding towards the northwest, and the endemic populations are sometimes being corralled there or being replaced by tropical species coming through Suez or even from the Atlantic. But the most important ones are Lesseps from the Suez Canal. And furthermore, this is the area, as you mentioned before, Ada, where most MPAs are currently located, which creates huge risks for conservation and problems for managers, of course. To this, we must add social problems such as the uneven economic, scientific, and adaptive capabilities in the region, and certain persisting political problems. For example, bathymetric data are nowadays crucial for contemporary models of population dynamics, and Israel has data of bathymetric data of incomparable quality, but it won't share it for security reasons. But also North African countries are persistently singled out for not producing sufficient data, or producing data of less quality than needed, or having bureaucracies more rigid than would be desirable, so data inaccessibility, so forth. Scientists have increasingly, in the last decades or 2 decades, since 2010, I think is the first mention of the concept sea under siege. Scientists have increasingly referred to the Mediterranean as a sea under siege to express the interconnected natural risks faced by the sea. I think this metaphor is appropriate, but it could well be broadened to account for the multiple actors and mutually conflicting agendas that we see in the region, that populate the region today. A vivid example of that comes from the MPA network domain, currently caught in a race to propose ever more larger and more sophisticated and comprehensive networks. In the figure, you can see proposals, for example, by the CSM, but various actors emerged in this talk, the CSM, the GFCM, General Fisheries Restricted Areas, but also Convention on Biological Diversity, Ecologically and Biologically Significant Areas, EBSAS, and many international NGOs, World Wide Fund, Greenpeace, Oceana, of new creation, recent creation, 2000s or so. These proposals add to the existing array of regional MPA networks, and some of them are really comprehensive. Look at CSM. We need to protect basically the entire Eastern Basin. And Greenpeace is also like, hey, what is this? Well, let's protect everything. Many ecologists and fisheries organizations have complained about these proposals. And also recent analysis, such as the one that I borrowed this picture from, have found these proposals to be largely incongruent. You can see it by eye, it's like they look very different, right? But they have made a more systematic study, finding them largely incongruent, with convergence appearing nearly impossible due to the differing goals of the different actors involved. The landscape thus illustrates that the Mediterranean is under a kind of siege, but not a climate siege, or more a social, ecological kind of siege, right? In the last centuries, then, to conclude, hey, it's been so quick. Scientists, governments, and policymakers, among other actors, have used systems thinking for framing the Mediterranean in various ways. As a critical system from a geopolitical or security standpoint, as a key subsystem of the world's oceans, as a miniature lab, or a model for studying climate and environmental change, as a testbed for regional environmental governance, for fisheries experiments, as a biodiversity hotspot, a climate hotspot, so forth. This history, we're trying to complement recent global histories of the earth and environmental sciences by highlighting the unique challenges involved in regional integration, whether scientific and political, by highlighting this plurality of projects and their conflicting nature sometimes. We also shed new light, I think, into the regional histories mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Clearly, the Mediterranean can no longer be seen anyway as the static and passive backdrop to human activity that was implied in the models of the Plan Bleu in the 80s, but rather as a social actor in its own right, and indeed a more ungovernable one than Peter Haas once argued or suggested. And our analysis, I think, also provide valuable nuance to Diana Davis' History of Mediterranean Terrestrial Ecology. Davis' article, which is beautiful, and I loved that article when I read, but nonetheless it's attackable, concludes by lamenting the diminishing or the diminished rather, the diminished influence of non-equilibrium ecology in recent environmental policies, arguing that traditional equilibrium policy got so entrenched in the colonial period that it proved hard to overthrow despite its manifest shortcomings. We see a different picture in the Mediterranean Sea, in marine ecology and governance more broadly, I would say. Here, non-equilibrium ecology has indeed gained favor among scientists and policymakers alike, yet this approach has not managed to solve the region's challenges or its inhabitants. Rather, it has cast those challenges in a new light, but also bringing about new areas and elements of conflict, and even, I would say, domination, but I haven't said that in the article. Well, that was all. Sorry for reading a lot.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now it's the time for questions. Jackie asking.
No, I think that's a clap.
Oh, that's a clap. Okay, I thought you were asking for the first question.
Well, somebody's writing.
Somebody's writing on the chat.
Yeah.
I mean, I can also ask a question if the
Yes,
floor is
please.
open.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
One thing, sorry, before,
Yeah.
one thing. This article was written in 6 hands. You have two. 6 hands. So Lino is more the first part of Cold War history of Mediterranean science. Pablo and I have been with physics, ecology, Pablo especially the physics side. We converged in ecology. I'm more the management governance side. The framework is indeed work of all of us. But if you have a specific question about one part, possibly somebody else will respond or should respond rather than I.
We will see. You're in charge today, so
Sorry for interrupting.
Jackie, and then we go for Max's question in the chat, but you can also voice it if you prefer. But Jackie, please.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for this presentation. Really interesting. As you said, tons of depth in there. I wanted to pick up a little bit on the place of ecology in all of this. So maybe it's helpful to have a little bit of kind of my background, which is that I work with ocean ecologists ethnographically. And I'm very curious about kind of what parts of ecology get integrated into these visions, because in my experience, that ends up being like a very politicized version, and they often distance themselves, in my case, from the fisheries people. So the fisheries folks they would be like the fisheries people over here, but then there's like kind of a more real or authentic ecology somewhere else that also has a very different teleology to it and different kind of politics and interests. So I'm interested how that distinction plays out in this story, and I'd love to hear more. Thanks.
Thank you. I would like to know more indeed about the relations between fishery science and management in the 50s, 70s period to ecologies, because I'm not so clear about that. I know about what you mentioned, that recently you have to see them as separate communities with separate identities. And I think that for some time that wasn't so much the case. I mean, there were more connections between them. But that's something we've been discussing in the making up of the paper, Pablo and I, because Pablo, I think, wanted to get deeper into the relations between and to clarify the scope of work in fisheries science and management and distinguish it from other ecological endeavors. We didn't have time or space for doing that.
I wanted to emphasize that systems ecology as a paradigm emerging, well, in the 50s and the 60s, but mostly through its application to marine management in the 70s in semi-enclosed seas was like the driving paradigm of these changes. So conservation biology, from the point of view of biodiversity studies, picks up a lot of the framework of systems ecology. Fishery sciences also evolves thanks to systems ecology. So plan of the framework was to actually make that more explicit, but in the end, we did not have a space for that. So we prefer to just acknowledge the role of systems ecology and then say these are the disparate set of chain effects that systems ecology had in Mediterranean ecology. So if you're wanting to pinpoint or single out one discipline or paradigm, I'd say is systems ecology applied to the Mediterranean, basically.
But if I get it correctly, what you're saying is that that might be so on paper, but the reality of maybe even current times is that both groups, despite maybe theoretically referring to the same core discipline, are not really sharing the same interests, right? Which is very interesting because so one of the problems, and I'm sorry because this is not supposed to be a discussion of a pre-circulated paper, yeah? This is just a talk. But obviously, because we just finished this paper, we will be referring to it, and most of you haven't read it. But the problem that we face is that we talk about many different actors and what brings them together. And then we also try to talk about what separates them and the conflicts they had, but we don't encompass everything. But this is what Pablo was saying. Yeah, instead of going into that particular story, we just point to the core discipline. But it would be super interesting to then be able to say, hey, but despite this shared knowledge, in practice, they have divergent interests. So we would be maybe also very interested in knowing if you could maybe, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but maybe summarize what kinds of conflicts are you discussing in your own work?
Okay, let's see if I can do like a very short. So the way that I would maybe see it is that fishery science comes from a very particular, it has a set history that also builds on particular management institutions, for example, ICES. Thinking of Helen Rozwadowski has this book on the history of ICES, where she talks about the development of specifically fisheries models. And it's one particular hegemonic approach to how to do modeling that then comes to dominate a lot of different fisheries organizations. And I think this is quite different from other attempts at modeling within ecology, which emerged much later. Actually, I would say a lot of the later attempts don't come out until around the 1980s, 1990s. And up until that point, ecology is very much this kind of, place-based, located, highly particular kind of science. And then in the 80s, 90s, we start to have more interest in kind of population management, and these kinds of models start to come in. There's a reference I'm thinking of, but I don't have it off the top of my head. But if it's of interest, I can send it forward. It's interested in different parts of ecology. So rather than thinking exclusively of populations, and indeed this logic of the Mediterranean or whatever location is having kind of a baseline you can exploit up to, which is, I would argue, a very fisheries dominated way of approaching a system. There's other kind of concerns within ecology that are trying to think about, for example, phytoplankton, let's say, and trying to think through different parts of the system. And then in my case now, like working up through to the present, a lot of people will say, well, actually, even today, we don't have like good or functional ecosystem models, and they don't get integrated into kind of wider modeling practices because there's so much we still don't know and that we still can't actually capture in those spaces. I think that's the closest I can get to a summary, but maybe if you have any other questions, you can kind of poke me a little bit.
May I add something? Yeah, I would say that in the one hand, when we mention fishery science, the core framework is population dynamics, which is something that comes before systems ecology, arguably. I think it was 1920s, 1930s when the first models of population dynamics actually applied to fisheries were developed. And then you have a later paradigm of ecosystem sciences. And so how do these conflicting paradigms that are operating at different scales, because fisheries is so species-centered, as Rosadowski acknowledges, but then how that competes with other more holistic approaches to ecology that want to encompass the whole ecosystem or their biochemical interactions. That comes in the, as I say, in the 80s and the 90s. So yeah, I think there's a lot of intellectual conflicts amongst the community in that sense.
One interesting, anecdote perhaps, but I think it's revealing. The father of non-equilibrium ecology, C.S. Holling, one of the fathers, also Robert May, very important, but Holling, his seminal article is published in the Resource Management Journal. Resource Management, I think it's named, Journal of Resource Management. So I think there are potential conflicts, but also there are overlaps that I think deserve history. So if anyone is taking the, perhaps for addressing it in the future, the relationships between these two streams or two sciences look interesting.
Okay, so we have topics to further discussion. Let's stay in touch. Max, microphone is not working, and he left a rather long question, which I can barely read from here. Can you, Jose Carlos? He says that the first one is specific, you can ignore it. Maybe you have.
Yeah. Did Ramon Margalef have a personal role in the UNEP map? Or perhaps more generally, how did his work on systems ecology and oceanography at the Instituto de Investigaciones Pesqueras impact the management discourses of the Mediterranean that you've discussed, 60s, 70s? I'd love to know. I know about his investigations on Mediterranean productivity. I know that's only a minor part of his work. He's been engaged in NATO Mediterranean Productivity Project, for example, producing work in Catalonia's costs for this project, and with many other important ecologists of the time. I don't know much more about his trajectory. We mentioned him in the article, incidentally, but only in that regard. And the other question?
Pablo, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I think he's prior to our time span. Is a bit the parallel of Odum and all the systems ecologists, terrestrial systems ecologists. He's from that first generation that first come out with these systemic ideas in the very post-war period, while our developments are more of the second generation of marine ecologists who have had a lot more training in physics and so on. Still, he's influential. He's a non-public figure, but he belongs to a prior generation, which we also cover in our article, but when we focus on systems, it's more on a later period, I'd say.
The second question also relates to him, so if you want
a bit more polemic, if you wish, or Margalef himself resisted labeling the Mediterranean as dead and viewed this switch to non-equilibrium ecology as catastrophic. He, like many systems ecologists, resisted the discourse of the environmentalist organizations who used engaged this non-equilibrium ecology. What was the role of the environmentalist movement in shaping the scientific and governance discourses, especially in the last decades of the 20th century? I'd like to know more about how non-equilibrium ecology came to be so important. There are interesting arguments out there in the literature, referring, for example, to the convergences between non-equilibrium ecology and neoliberal ideology. Arguments by Walker and Cooper. There's a reference article, fantastic article, if you want to read it, 2011, Walker and Cooper, Genealogies of Resilience, treating about the common origins of neoliberal ideology and resilience. But I know there's the important figure of Holling promoting this doctrine or approach from the Resilience Alliance, which later became enshrined or sort of a larger project in the Stockholm Resilience Center, now a leading world hub on social ecological research, earth system science, and many things. I don't know. I'd like to know more.
I mean, about the role of the environmentalist movement, I think that we acknowledge that it's an actor that plays a role in the whole period, also related to ecology. But the very core conceptual dilemma that underlies our scientific discussion is humankind disturbing the system from an external point of view, or is it a part of the system? That is very clear in the case of a system that's supposedly a bit foreign to human affairs, such as the sea, right? That was the conception back then. But then it turns out that it does not happen that way, because every waste you dump into the sea, it will come back to you, and it will affect all the fisheries you manage, all the food you eat from the sea, all the resources you use. But that very specific conceptual dilemma, I don't think we analyze how it plays out specifically in the Mediterranean. We stick to, as you say, to arguments that are out there in the literature, but there's not such thing as a Mediterranean environmentalist actor that we point to. We point more to political institutions and scientific institutions and so on.
Yeah, I don't think speaking about the environmentalist movement in this regard is useful. It's a very broad category. Perhaps focusing on specific actors and also specific theories that make transition or passage from traditional ecology to non-equilibrium systems ecology is more useful. For example, convergence with Gaia theory, convergence with niche construction theory in ecology at the time also was already widespread. So these are theories that more or less converge or match well one another and in an interconnected whole. And I think already when the International Biosphere Program is created, non-equilibrium ecology is well settled, comes from NASA, this project, doesn't come from the environmentalist movement. So I don't know the role of the environmentalist movement there. I would like to know.
I think Sam's been.
Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
I have a question, but I'm just going to pick up on that if it's okay. I agree that, so full disclosure, I have actually read a draft of the manuscript. So I know the paper on the manuscript, presentation of the manuscript. I agree. I don't think looking at the environmental movement in a general way is very helpful. It'll confuse things. However, what is in the paper and what was in your presentation is a whole variety of non-state actors. And you need to be more clear on who and what and where these things are. So whether they're intergovernmental, whether they're non-governmental, it's not clear in the paper to the reader at the minute or in your presentation. And I think that's clear because those advocacy groups would allow you to represent the environmental movement, because that's where those NGOs and or NSAs, as we use it in IR terms, but NGOs or IGOs are coming from, especially when it's scientifically led, right? So I think you should think about that. But excuse me, my question is more about the process of systems making, which I think is currently a little bit, it's there in the paper, you guys all understand it because you're really embedded in the literature, but anyone coming to this new, it's a bit lost. And one of the things that in particular, I don't know if we can bring the slides back up, but on the slide that had section 3, you had an image. Can we bring the slides or should I just describe what the image was?
Yeah, we're trying to share it.
This is not.
So it's the one that was number 3, and it had a map of the Mediterranean, and it had depth and a coastline. It's like a 3-dimensional map.
No,
Right.
3-dimensional map.
Was it
The Eastern Mediterranean transient,
Right.
yeah.
this one?
And earlier than that, I think it might be slide 4.
This one?
No, this is
no,
No.
down.
This guy.
7, maybe.
We'll find it.
I mean, it could have been that one you just had, actually. Just that one will do. The one you just had.
This
Right.
one?
Show us, yeah, the one you just, yeah. Number 8.
Okay.
8.
Okay.
Oh,
Oh,
that
sorry.
one. 8.
Not this one. Oh, okay.
Slide 8. Go back.
There we go.
There we go. Right. So I'm going to use this image as an example for my question, which is who is involved and who is who is included and who is excluded in the process of systems making. If we take the example of this map, you've got depth of the Mediterranean, and you've got a particular perspective, which is looking towards the northern coast of the Mediterranean to the exclusion of the southern coast. And I would suggest that in the entirety of your paper as it's presented, actors from the northern coast and its representative states gets an awful lot of prominence, and we hear very little from the southern states, and that's a problem that runs all the way through the paper from your point about I think it's really early on in the presentation as well, about mismanagement of resources and desertification in North Africa as being a justification for colonialism. So could you just speak a little bit more to the politics and the technopolitics, to use your language, within the process of systems making, specifically about who is included and excluded and why that might matter, or do you think that matters? Does that make sense? Hopefully.
Yeah, I cannot address your question in its entirety, but I wanted to talk about something that I didn't in the end, just for lack of time, which is the images like this, EBM, are not, of course, innocuous. You know, they put you with a particular in contact with a particular ontology. You know, here you have the management pillar, which is on top of the social and ecological pillar, and this series of triangles representing states. You know, it's all like smooth integration, or apparently smooth things wanting to be considered, or that the framework creator wanted to consider, but of course the organization of the elements and everything is not innocuous. It says things, you know, like this role of the manager on top of the ecosystem and on top of the people, even though there's participation. And so, yeah, I think this is the kind of reflection that could help, and relatedly what he said, you know, the visions, including the visions not just of the northern authors, authors from the north, or views from the north, such as very explicitly in the Eastern Mediterranean transient, but also, you know, alternatives, or at least making explicit, you know, the fact how this vision embodies this perspective, right? Thank you for that.
Yeah, I would add that a crucial actor here, as in many other histories of North-South tensions in environmental governance, was the United Nations, that of course has a very clear and important position in our paper. And so the UNEP projects, they were framed as research and development. So the issue was not only to remove marine pollution, but also to target responsibilities among countries. But that is, of course, hard to do because the sea has no boundaries. But then in the end, that was finally pursued, and it was done, but not without tensions, because I think in the beginning, I don't know if we have enough space in the paper to tell this in detail. I think we don't, but the first MEDX studies, that's how they're called, of Mediterranean pollution, they targeted towards, of course, northern and eastern, that is Israeli-Lebanon coast sources of pollution, but the responsibilities were distributed among the entirety of the Mediterranean riparian countries. But then afterwards, this changed a bit more, and I think in the later phases, there was a bit more equity and homogeneity in the distribution of responsibilities. But this is just about the research management of pollution. But then there was the developmental side of the UNEP and UNESCO programs, and they were trying to frame these interdisciplinary research projects. So maybe our sources, they are very Western laden, and that is something we can acknowledge. But it is true that there are sources where maybe 10 to 15 authors are enlisted as contributors, and many of them come from Egypt, from Morocco, from other non-European Mediterranean countries. So that is something to take into account, I think. So yeah.
So that's one of my, if I've got a criticism of the paper as it is, you are very critical of people black boxing things in your ecological systems. You black boxed UNIP. You don't show who are the actors involved and who are there, what are the politics. The UN is not some magical kingdom where there is all peace and love and happiness. There's quite a lot of tension there, and I think maybe you should try a bit more to bring out. I also think I want to finish with this so that Lino can go to someone else, that you've written a brilliant paper that could be 3 other papers, and you probably do need to write all 3 of them and think about which audiences you're trying to communicate to. There's a paper in here for policy, there's a paper in here for history, and there's a paper in here for the history and philosophy of science, thinking about Earth system science and its relationship to governance. There's 3 different papers, which means that you're kind of, I agree, right at the word limit, but I would encourage you to think about how you make it work without antagonizing the peer reviewer, but at the same time thinking about where else you can use this sort of material to speak more directly to the communities that I think you're trying to talk to, specifically in this section 4, where you're trying to talk to the mistakes and missteps that suggest that Haas is a very Whiggish version, so that'd be a very positive version of what is actually quite a messy politics. And in trying to present a cleaner version, we don't really simplify. We simplify the explanation to the point where it doesn't do justice to the complex techno-political, to use your language again, arena in which these scientists and these systems people are having to work. These systems are fragile, I would argue, and you sometimes stray in the paper in presenting them as quite firm. Haas in particular presents his systems as very firm, and we know as historians and philosophers of science that they are as fragile as a Fabergé egg that's about to get thrown off a mountain. So yeah, that's it. Thank you guys. It's great. It's a great piece of work.
Thank you very much. And to be completely honest, one of the problems now is that this paper was very much like almost philosophical history or history and philosophy of the Earth system sciences, and then we were black boxing the politics. We were referring to it, but black boxing it, and this also reflects the composition of the 3 authors. So some of us come from history, some from philosophy, some try to combine history and philosophy, and as it stands, the paper speaks more to the history of system thinking, but very kind of epistemological internal history that will not satisfy many historians of science because they want to see more of the politics. And I think the 3 of us share the ideal that good epistemological histories of science should also incorporate the politics as internal, right? But that's, of course, easier said than done. But we'll take that into account in rethinking a little bit some parts of the paper. Yeah. Any more questions? Ada, please.
Yes, I did have a question, but I'm taking you back to the beginning of the paper and the presentation, and it's something that you actually sort of mentioned in passing, and I wonder if you could expand a little bit. You say that the British see, like during British imperialism, late imperialism, they see the Mediterranean more as a hydrological unit than a geographical region. Can you expand on that? Like, is this your opinion? Is this something that you're taking? Is this an established view? Because that's a big claim to make, and I was wondering where that
I think that comes from me, maybe, and also from my work with Alberto here.
That's great that you know.
Yes. So it basically refers to the fact that, according to Davies and others that we've read, so you also know him, they talk about the French as inventing the geobotanical region and then climatic region of the Mediterranean. And that's the region of the geographers and also the one that ends up interesting Fernand Braudel, nonetheless. Yeah, he doesn't talk much about the sea at all when he talks about the Mediterranean as a place of connectivity. He talks about the sea as a plateau for connectivity, and when he talks about the environment as a necessary background for political history, he's talking about the climate. And that what we say there is that in contrast to that more continental tradition, the British approach to the Mediterranean was more engaged with water. Obviously, because as a maritime empire, what they were doing in the Mediterranean was sailing, basically. So their studies of the Mediterranean as a region, their studies of underwater currents, of sub-regional areas in the Mediterranean, all of those from the early 19th century onwards were more related to the sea than the other ones. I think that's what we refer to in that point.
Okay, so your point is not so much that they are actively trying to make this to make the Mediterranean into a maritime space exclusively. It's just, it's sort of the result of their specific interest
Exactly.
as a
Exactly. I mean, if this were a very linear history of systems thinking, it would be a history of how different ways of looking at the Mediterranean, maritime, atmospheric, climatic, and so on, ecological, are being encompassed. We are explicitly trying not to write a very linear history, in that there are conflicts, there are tensions, and there are things that are integrated, but other things that are left out, and so on. And we do focus on the maritime part of the system. We talk about atmosphere, water relationships, and so on, but we don't talk about the Mediterranean region as in the broader sense of the vegetations of North Africa. We don't care about that. We care about the Mediterranean Sea as such. Yeah, and I think the point there is just to say that some other approaches to the Mediterranean as a system were more interested in the region than the sea.
Okay.
This is interesting because there is some literature in Mediterranean studies about the birth, the scientific invention of the Mediterranean region. So the sort of a biography of the Mediterranean as a scientific object, and they are focused on land rather than on the sea. So that's one of the things that several papers actually written by deep med researchers are trying to point, like, hey, there are other approaches to the Mediterranean region which are more maritime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Julia, yes.
It's a very broad clarification question, but it might be, maybe it's very obvious what the answer is, but I don't know. I guess the fact that it wasn't that clear to me, at least, can say something about how certain things maybe could be spelled out a little bit more. So I thought in the conclusions you make a few very nice points that seem to be very helpful to kind of summarize different perspective, also the more historical, political, philosophical in the paper, but I wish you had said a bit more. For instance, there's a point in the conclusions where you say that these diverse perspectives that you have discussed have emerged from this process. That the fact that they have emerged from this process demonstrate that system thinking on the one hand and scientific and political pluralism on the other hand are not as inherently antagonistic as often assumed. So you argue that they can both challenge and enrich one another. And the problem is that here I really didn't get where you show the scientific and political pluralism in clear contrast with this system thinking, and who are the people who think that they were inherently antagonistic, and how you argue that they can enrich one another. So this is really a very broad clarification question, but I think if you manage to spell this out in each subsection a bit more clearly, I think this can be perhaps very helpful to actually make stronger, more coherent argument throughout it, because I didn't see where this pluralism is and who says that this is antagonistic to system thinking.
Yeah.
Maybe you could say.
It's I think I agree that it's an ambiguous statement that needs clarification and some examples. If it's going to be argued for, it needs to be argued for well with an example drawn from the text, and I think we can do that easily. We're going to have more problems with Mustafa Tolba and other people from UNED. We cannot cite everyone. Yeah, simply, especially when writing that section, we've had the permanent problem that we were addressing a monograph. We're not addressing an article. It's an established monograph reference book on that topic, which is obviously more detailed than our account. So it's been difficult to both refer to it, provide supplementary material, and criticize it. So that's been a permanent problem since the beginning, and it's still the longest section in the entire paper, but we will do something about it. Thanks for your point, because I think we need an example there for putting everything together. Thanks, Julia.
Okay. We may be reaching the point of conclusion. Sam?
I just wanted to talk about the Suez Canal, because I think this is a whole deep med problem as well. So not just this paper. That, just to be clear, the British Maritime Empire hates the idea of a Suez Canal, and from about 1795 onwards, actively opposes it. And when it's created, you are correct, and you say in the paper, 71% of all of the maritime traffic that goes through the canal is British flagged. True. But the British don't like the fact they don't control it. And it's one of the reasons given as a justification for invading Egypt in 1882 and taking control. So you say it in the paper a little bit that, the British Maritime Empire, one of the great aspects of control of the British Maritime Empire is, one, that it doesn't hold a very great amount of land that's connected to anywhere else, Gibraltar being an exception, but Malta is isolated and allows that sea power to control it, so that it can't be easily dislodged from the Mediterranean space. And by not having a Suez Canal, you have to pass Gibraltar, which the British have spent a lot of time fortifying as a space, controlling as a customs space. And one of the things that I think you could bring out in the paper, especially when you're talking about fisheries, is the idea of there being geoeconomics involved here. So I can't remember who said in response to my earlier answer that the problem is there's no containment at sea and things move. That is a problem. That is a big problem throughout all of your paper's time span, that the fish move. So fisheries science is great, but are you monitoring the same population of fish? Are they moving? Who owns them? Where's the economic control? So I just wanted to say that just to be clear, because I've heard it in other papers that I've been to, that the Suez Canal and the British Empire take great advantage of it, which is true, but they did. That's not to say that they wanted it, because they didn't. But when it's there, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Sorry, just wanted to spin it in off the last two questions.
That's great, and I take the opportunity to announce one of the talks in the monthly DeepMed seminar, which is 11th of June. You have time to mark your calendars. Mohamed Gamal Eldin will be talking about the Suez Canal and the making of the Mediterranean. So but that's a very good point of yours, because it's true that I've always considered it an advantage for managing the maritime empire, but only if they control it. So you're right that depending on a piece on land that you didn't need to depend on before, it's an issue. If you can have the same maritime empire without needing to control that piece of land. At the same time, it's true that it made transports and connections to India much cheaper. Yeah, so there are advantages and disadvantages and everything, but it's true that it was not a British project. That's for sure. And this has to do also, as you know, with the problem of that we discussed briefly in the paper of the so-called invasive species, and also the very idea of invasive species being one of the things that changes if you move into a more dynamic view of the ecology in which species are moving into new environments all the time through the history of evolution, let's say, yeah. So the different thinking on that, it's also interesting. Yes. By the way, I take the opportunity to announce another, in October, November, we'll have a workshop on resources and borders, and a little bit more on the ecology, the history of how ecologists have thought about invasive species through the Suez Canal will also be considered, apparently.
There's a question online.
Yeah, please, Mikel.
Yes, hello everyone. Thanks very much for the presentation. It's very interesting. I'm working in the Institute of Marine Sciences in Barcelona, and thanks also for the DMed as a project, because it's very interesting and nice to hear you from time to time. I just want to point out that you mentioned you focus your research on the marine protected areas, and you very well spotted that it's more or less in the north and in the coastal areas. But I think there's an interaction here which is also interesting, which is the areas that are managed through fisheries management measures. And in particular in the Mediterranean, there's a very interesting case because there's the fishery restricted areas. And the fishery restricted areas are non-coastal areas. So it's, in fact, anything which is below 800 meters cannot be fished, which is much more strict in terms of conservation, let's put it that way, than most of the marine protected areas. So I think that there's a point here in connection between both sides, the conservation policies, the fisheries policies, that points us to different directions. So just to suggest you to dig a little bit more here, because I think it's interesting because it's ruled by another multi-stakeholder and multi-party GFCN body, which is also part of the FAO structure. So it is about the United Nations structure. So just to point out that that can be interesting for you if you want to dig a bit. I think there's things to work on that. Thank you.
Absolutely, that's very, very interesting. Yeah, very relevant. Thank you.
Apunta.
And of course, if you need any information from me and you can find it, I just wrote you my email here.
Thank you. Yeah,
Good.
yeah.
Thank
We
you.
will contact you for sure. Thanks for coming and for introducing yourself.
Welcome.
Okay, wonderful. So we'll continue the conversation over coffee, and we have lots to do. Thanks to everyone. So yeah, we'll keep in touch. We've moved, by the way, next seminar. It was scheduled for January the 22nd. It will be now January the 29th, and it's Davide Orsini talking about what he likes most, which is nuclear contaminants in the Mediterranean Sea and that kind of thing. So it's going to be great. Bye bye. Thanks for coming.
Bye.
Bye.